It had been a long day. Every day was a long day when you were a farmer, but today the hogs had been acting up, and the feed delivery hadn't arrived on time, and the gosh darn rooster had got loose again and tried to start a fight with the cat. Jimmy Joe wasn't as young as he used to be. Retirement was a dirty word in his vocabulary, but after a day like today, he could see the benefit of hiring in some more help, maybe cutting back his hours from 14 down to 12. Getting old was a bitch, all right. Or maybe he'd just put his feet up tonight and see how he felt in the morning. No call to go making rash decisions. He was only in his 60s, and old Billy Roy had kept going on his own until he was almost 90. Sitting out on his porch with a cold beer in the warmth of a Tennessee summer night, he just felt fortunate that he got to wake up and work his farm every day. More than a few of his neighbors had gone belly up over the years, having to sell their farm due to illness or bad loans. A lot of them, in fact. Times had been tough recently, and the ones who hadn't sold up had been moved into an old folks' home by their ingrate children, or they were already in the parish cemetery, God rest their souls. Hardly any of his friends were left now, he realized. Whether he kept on working like he always had or started to wind down a little, he just had to thank his lucky stars that he was still going at all. Speaking of which, a flash of light above the horizon caught his eye. Shooting star. Make a wish, his grandmother had used to say, although he didn't know what he should be wishing for tonight. He already had most everything he wanted, except maybe someone to have a beer and shoot the breeze with. That shooting star was getting awful bright, streaking across the sky like a firework on 4th of July. In fact, if he didn't know better, he'd think it was coming right at... Son of a gun. That fireball was definitely getting closer. For a second he was worried, and he was about to call into the house to tell Georgina to get into the storm cellar, but it was coming in too quick. Came screaming down out of the night, trailing red fire behind it, and impacted in the forest with a rumbling thunder that rolled over the fields and echoed off the barn, and after bouncing round the yard a few times, finally trailed off like a bass guitar, holding the final note in its strings, long after the guitarist had let go. The cat looked up from its nap, looked around, then decided that if the rooster couldn't dislodge it from its favorite spot on the porch, a mere meteor strike sure wouldn't, and rested its head back on its paws again. Jimmy Joe set down his beer. There was a smoke plume rising like the old Injun war signals, and from the look of it, it was only a mile or two off. The forest there was swampy, left to overgrow because the land was more useful for drainage than as pasture. Shouldn't be any danger of a fire starting, but better to take a look just in case. Besides, he might get to see a genuine piece of outer space. Probably not much chance of finding anything, not with all the water around there, but you never knew your luck. Be something to show folks who came visiting, a genuine meteorite. So he hauled his old behind off the swing bench, got his truck going with a kick, and started heading out there. Far as he could see, the smoke was coming from his property, so he shouldn't have to trouble the neighbors. It was getting properly dark now, the last glimmers of the dusk fading below the horizon, but he had a flashlight, and he was confident he knew the woods well enough to have a quick look around without getting himself drowned. After a few minutes stomping between the trees, he was less confident. One of his boots had almost been sucked right off his foot, and the midges were drawn to the flashlight like insects towards a bright light. But he could see the swath the falling meteorite had carved through the forest, and between the charred and ember-flecked tree trunks, he could see a red glow. He was close. Suddenly he was splashing in water, and although it wasn't coming over the top of his boots yet, he thought about turning back. Almost did too, but he knew he'd regret it if he didn't look. A ring of shattered tree trunks, still on fire but flickering out now. And in the middle of them, well, ain't that a thing? That weren't no space rock, or any other kind of rock. It was a disc, and although it was embedded in the mud at an angle so only half of it was visible, it must be a good 20 or 30 feet across. It was shiny, metallic, and he couldn't see a single seam or rivet. If he didn't know any better, Jimmy Joe would almost think it was a flying sow. Hold on, what was that? By the light of the guttering flames, he saw something floating in the water. He turned the flashlight on it. Well now, either someone was playing the most elaborate practical joke of all time, or that was one of them extraterrestrials the movies were always going on about. And Jimmy Joe didn't think it was a prank for the simple reason that no one he knew had the wherewithal to pull something like this together, and he wasn't important enough for anyone else to bother. He'd found himself a gosh-darned alien. The little green man wasn't green, and he wasn't all that little, but he clearly wasn't no human being neither. His bald head was a little bigger than usual, as were his eyes, but it was the total lack of a nose that gave it away. The rest of him was human-looking at first glance, but his limbs were a little too long, and the joints weren't in quite the right place. It was hard to tell what color his skin was in the darkness, but it might be a mottled, off-white cream. Jimmy Joe paused at this point, wondering whether he should go back to the truck and get his gun. But the alien was pretty beat up. He was wearing a silver flight suit that had a couple of rips and tears in it, and a couple of scratches on his face that looking like they were bleeding blue. Looked to be unconscious, if not dead, and if he wasn't dead yet, then he soon would be, lying in this swamp. A life of pig farming hadn't really prepared Jimmy Joe to make first contact with a being from another world, and he'd be the first to admit that. He had half a mind to turn around now, and forget he ever saw a thing. Let the ship and its pilot sink into the mud, and no one would ever know. But he was here now, and besides, leaving an injured man to die, even if he wasn't technically a man, wasn't something he could do in good conscience. So he hauled the alien out of the water, and it was a good thing he were none too heavy, because although in his day Jimmy Joe had been able to lift a 300-pound hog on his shoulders, that day were 40 years past. He was huffing and puffing by the time he lay the alien in the bed of his truck, and it struck him what a strange scene this would be. He had a heart attack right now, him lying dead, and an alien in his truck. People would probably think he'd been killed by some alien death ray or something, instead of all those decades of bacon fat. Which finally made him think that it was going to be a strange sight for Georgina when she saw what he'd found whatever happened. Bringing a spaceman home without so much as a heads up wasn't going to improve his chances of surviving the night either. His wife had put up with a lot over the years, and this might be the straw, well, the solid lead pipe, that finally broke the camel's back. He thought about putting the alien in the barn, out of sight. But she'd find out anyway, she always did, and keeping secrets only made her madder. And this was a doozy of a secret to be keeping. When he broke one of the plates they'd got as a wedding present and hid the fragments in the basement, she'd given him the silent treatment for a whole month. Concealing the existence of life from another planet under their very own roof was likely to see him sleeping on the couch for a while longer than that, he reckoned. Better to take the Band-Aid off in one quick pull. When the truck rolled up in the yard, the first thing he did was yell, "Hey, Georgie, come look at this." Then it occurred to him that he could have gone in and talked to her instead of hollering for her like she was one of the hogs. Oh well, she knew what she was getting when she married him, and it wasn't refined manners. She came bustling out the back door with her apron still on and flour on her hands, looking none too happy. "Jimmy Joe, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times not to bother me while I'm in the kitchen. Not if you want dinner on the table at a reasonable hour. That pie isn't going to get itself in the oven, let me tell." "Oh my goodness." She stopped dead in her tracks. "What on earth is that?" "Ain't nothing on Earth, Georgie. Spaceship came down in the woods." He pointed back at the red glow still visible in the distance. "Lord save me, James Joseph Dodgson. This had better not be one of your jokes. If that's someone in a rubber mask waiting to jump up and scare the bejesus out of me, it ain't. Georgie, I swear on my life it's real. I thought it was a meteor coming down at first, but when I went to check I found a flying saucer, except it weren't flying no more, and this fella was lying next to it." "And you just picked him up?" his wife hissed. "Well, yeah." "Sweet mercy, Jimmy Joe. Sometimes I wonder if you have less sense now than the day your mama brought you into this world, God rest her soul. Bad enough I have to stop the cat from bringing home every poor critter it comes across, without you too. Did you not stop to think that it might be carrying diseases for which we don't have no... what's the term? Natural immunity? Did you never see War of the Worlds?" No." His brow furrowed. "How do you know what happens in War of the Worlds?" She sniffed. "I'm not above enjoying watching Tom Cruise running around getting all hot and bothered, even if he is a heathen. A woman's got to have some pleasures in life, and I suppose you didn't think about the radiation either." "Radiation? Of course. If he came down in a spaceship, and that spaceship is damaged, then it could be spilling out radiation all over the place." It seemed obvious now that she pointed it out, but this was why for over 40 years she'd been the brains of the operation, while he was mostly just there for wrestling the hogs into line. "Well, I feel fine. First thing tomorrow, you're to go over to Bo's and get his Geiger counter," she told him, then seeing his blank expression added, The thing they use to measure radiation. Why does Bo have a Geiger counter? Jimmy Joe's brother-in-law was a scrap metal dealer, and although he had many sidelines, legal and illegal, Jimmy Joe was pretty sure a nuclear physicist wasn't one of them. Honey, you've got to have one in a scrap yard. Radiation's used in all sort of things. You never know when it'll get mixed into a load of old scrap. He had a shipment last year that was contaminated with medical waste from the old hospital. I'm sure I mentioned it. She shook her head. It had long been a bone of contention that every piece of family news she shared went in one ear and out the other. Now, tomorrow you'll go back to the forest with the Geiger counter and make sure nothing's leaking. But right now we have to deal with this poor soul. He looks like he's in a bad way. She leaned over him and placed the back of her hand on his forehead. Wait, didn't you just say about disease? Well, it's too late for that, isn't it? She huffed. You've given me every cough and cold you ever caught, Jimmy Joe. If you've got the plague, then I'll get it sooner or later too. We'll just have to trust in the Lord and stay away from other people for a bit. It's not like we get out much these days anyway. Carefully, she turned the alien's head to the side, checking his wounds. My goodness, the poor thing. He's in a bad way. Might be best to call an ambulance for him. Jimmy Joe shook his head. Come on, Georgie. If we do that, the government will get their hands on him, and who knows what they do to him. Besides, it's not like the doctors at the hospital would know how to help any better than we would. She thought for a moment. You've got a good point there, honey. I reckon the best thing anyone can do is bandage him up. Presumably he needs his blood to stay on the inside of his body just like we do. Come on, bring him into the house and I'll have a look at him. Put him in the guest bedroom. Jimmy Joe carried the alien into the house and somehow managed to get him up the stairs, only bonking his head on the wall once. Georgina got her first aid kit out and applied a little antiseptic and some bandages. She didn't dare give him any medicines, so after she was finished bandaging the last cut, it was just a game of wait and see. And wait, they did. The next morning, Jimmy Joe went over to Bo's and got the Geiger counter like Georgie said. His brother-in-law had given him some odd looks, but he was the sort of person who stayed out of other people's business in the hope that they'd stay out of his. The flying saucer was right where he left it, a curiously undramatic circle of metal now that it was daytime and the fires had died down. Fortunately, the needle barely even twitched when he went near it, and it didn't look to be leaking anything into the water, so he just left it where it was for the time being. The only things that would ever find it out there would be the turtles, and they weren't likely to tell anyone. It was 2 more days before the alien even stirred. Georgina had been getting worried. She'd tried giving him a little water, on the basis that every living thing on planet needed water, and if he could breathe our air, then he probably came from a world that wasn't too different to Earth. And the alien had swallowed it without choking or throwing up, which was a good sign. She was a smart woman, and it wasn't the first time Jimmy Joe had thought she was too good for a hog farm. And for him to come to that. But she had no idea what he could or couldn't eat, and didn't think it was safe to try giving him stuff at random. She was worried enough that she was just about to start experimenting with giving him little bits of food when she came in to find him sitting up in the bed. He still wasn't strong. He could barely hold his head up without support. But at least he was conscious now. When Georgina saw him sitting up, staring at her with those big black eyes, she suddenly came over all shy and ran to get Jimmy Joe right away. "Can you understand me?" was the first thing he could think of to ask. The alien blinked at him. Then it said, "Yes, I have a neural implant that automatically translates for me. It is still adapting, but your language is not complicated." Good. Do you need anything? We gave you some water, and we were wondering what you might eat, but we didn't know, so we just left it until you woke up." Jimmy Joe was talking faster than normal, and sweating too. The sheer insanity of the situation was finally starting to catch up to him now that the alien was actually awake. "Any carbohydrate will be sufficient for now," the alien said calmly. "It will be a while before I need more complex nutrients." It said it with a flat cadence, so it sounded completely unemotional, but Jimmy Joe figured that might be something to do with the translator, and was kind of proud of himself that he'd thought of that. Sure, I'll get right on that." Hopefully Georgie would know what a carbohydrate was. "Is there anything else I can do to make you comfortable? Can you tell me what condition my ship is in? I assume you found it." "Yeah, out in the woods. It looked like it was still in one piece, but half of it was below the waterline, so I couldn't get a good look at all of it." "I see. I will go out and assess the damage myself when I am able, if that is allowable. Sure, it's on my land, no problem taking you out there. It's a bit of a trek though, so it'll have to wait until you're all fixed up. Don't worry though, you've got that bed for as long as you need it, and my wife and I will make sure you've got everything you need, as far as we can. I see. The alien cocked its head. May I ask why you have done this? Done what? Rescued me and taken care of me. I understood that the inhabitants of this planet have had no formal contact with alien species before. That's true as far as I know. Then this must have come as quite a shock. Yet you saved me anyway. Yeah, well, seemed the decent thing to do. They stared at each other for a moment. The alien didn't seem to have anything more to say, so Jimmy Joe got up to leave. If you need anything, just call out. Me or my wife will be around. He'd just turned towards the door when the alien said, in the same flat cadence, Thank you for saving my life. Sure, no problem. I'm sure anyone else would have done the same. The alien paused for a moment, then just when Jimmy Joe was about to leave again, it said, No, they wouldn't. I have traveled quite widely throughout the galaxy, and I'm sure very few would risk such a great unknown in order to help a stranger. Thank you. Well, you're welcome. Think nothing of it. Jimmy Joe replied, unsure what else to say. It seemed like this time the alien really was done speaking, so he backed out of the room and closed the door. Over the last few days, he'd been going over whether he'd really done the sensible thing bringing an alien into his house. He still wasn't sure one way or the other, but what he was sure of now, and this was the one that mattered, was that he'd done the right thing. The alien continued to improve over the next couple of days, especially after they fed him some bread and some potatoes, which turned out to be what carbohydrates were according to Georgie. A week after the crash, he was able to take his first steps out of the bed with Jimmy Joe's help. He was anxious to go and see his ship, but clambering through the woods was difficult enough for a healthy human being, so Georgie put her foot down and said he wasn't to go anywhere until he could walk on his own, which seemed reasonable. He was also anxious to know something else. Have you told anyone I'm here? The cadence was getting less flat now. Jimmy Joe could almost think he was picking up a note of fear there. He shook his head. No one but me and Georgie know. I think my brother-in-law Beau might suspect something's up, but he's not the sort to say anything. Especially to the feds. No need to worry about some government goons coming to take you away. It's our little secret. Thank you. Although it was not your government I was worried about. You have access to global information networks here, don't you? You mean the internet? Sure, we've got that. It would be best if you did not make any references to my presence, even using a program you believe to be cryptographically secure. Jimmy Joe thought about that for a moment. Someone looking for you, huh? Someone from... His eyes turned up to the ceiling. Up there. And you don't want to be found. It would be best if you did not make any references to my presence, the alien repeated, and didn't follow it up with anything. Jimmy Joe decided to leave it there for now, but he made a mental note to come back to that later. The next day, the alien was finally strong enough to make it down the stairs and took his first steps outside. Not very far outside, admittedly. He got as far as the porch before he had to sit down. But it was progress. Dusk was setting in, and Jimmy Joe was sitting on the swing bench next to the alien. Listen, he said. I've been calling you the alien for the past week now. Do you have a name I can use? The alien hadn't volunteered anything, and Georgina said it was best not to ask, in case it was offensive in their culture, but this was just getting silly. It is better that you do not ask that question, the alien answered. Damn it, she was right. Sorry if I offended you, Jimmy Joe said. It is not a question of offense. You cannot betray to others what you do not know. Oh, is this to do with them up there? The ones you don't want finding you? Yes. If you don't mind my asking, what are you on the run from? You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I feel like since you're staying in my house, I have a right to know. That is a fair statement. I will tell you as much as does not put you in danger. The alien paused, as if wondering how to continue, then said, I'm what you might call an independent businessman. I sell certain consumables that let's call it the government, believe should be unavailable above a certain strength because of their intoxicative effects. A great many people find this overly restrictive. I provide the goods they want, which is illegal, and I do it without paying taxes, which is even more illegal. Jimmy Joe sat there, mouth hanging open. You mean you're a bootlegger? The alien blinked. I'm sorry, my translator cannot parse that term. Could you describe it more? Well, I suppose they're people who find people producing alcohol, well, intoxicative substances, illegally, and provide transportation to get it from the producer to the customer at the other end, while dodging the law and the taxman. Oh, yes, that's exactly what I am. Jimmy Joe's face split into a grin. Well, gosh darn it, why didn't you say so? This county's got a long and proud tradition of sheltering bootleggers, and I'm not about to go against tradition. So, how'd you end up here anyway? My most recent business activities had drawn an unusual degree of attention from law enforcement. It became necessary for me to find a planet where I could lay low for a while. There are laws against visiting uncontacted worlds, so the police are limited in how openly they can operate on them. And even by the standards of uncontacted worlds, Earth is something of a backwater. No offense. None taken. We're used to being a backwater around here, although I'd love you hear you say that to a New Yorker. Anyway, do go on. Unfortunately, some of my past business associates were waiting for me. I will not tell you too much about them so as not to put you in danger, but long story short, we parted ways because they were less than honest. They tried to cheat me out of my last shipment to them, which ended up backfiring. Apparently they've been holding a grudge, because when I came out of hyperspace they were right there, and opened fire on my ship without so much as stopping to gloat. They must have assumed my ship was destroyed in the crash, or they would have come after me, but just in case it'd be better if no one else knew I was here. The local wardens, those tasked with making sure Earth remains isolated until it is ready to make contact with the wider galaxy, would likely have picked up the weapons fire, and be on the lookout for me as well. So it would be very helpful if my presence here was not broadcast. This county's got a long and proud tradition of stonewalling the government too. Don't you worry, I won't be mentioning you to the neighbors, but no one around here would rat you out. Make yourself at home, because you're safe here for as long as you need it. Thank you. The alien fixed its dark eyes on Jimmy Joe. I'm afraid my translator cannot adequately convey how grateful I am for this. Jimmy Joe shrugged, hoping the alien didn't know enough to know that he was blushing a little. Oh, don't think nothing of it. I still feel like I should have something to call you by, though, even if it's not your real name. No sooner had he said it than inspiration struck. Say, I know exactly what you should call yourself while you're here. There used to be a word for folks who ran bootleg moonshine. Moonrunner. He looked out towards the darkening horizon, where the bright silver disk of the moon was just starting to rise above the tree line. I reckon that's appropriate. Moonrunner. The alien paused. Then his facial expression altered for the first time since he'd woken up. For a moment, he managed a passable approximation of a smile. I like it. And what should I call you? Well, everyone but my wife calls me JJ. A few days later, and Moonrunner was finally strong enough for JJ to take him out to the forest to have a look at his ship. Fortunately, the damage didn't seem to be irreparable, although they'd still need to find a way to get it out of the swamp so he could work on it. The only person JJ knew who had a truck big enough to drag the ship out of the swamp was his brother-in-law. And although Moonrunner wasn't happy about bringing more people in on the secret, if JJ was prepared to vouch for Bo, then that was good enough for him. They came back that night, having spent all day tramping around the swamp trying to work out the best way to get the ship out. Both of them were exhausted, but they were both pleased with themselves as well, because it seemed like finally they were making progress. As they sat there on the porch swing, looking up at the stars, JJ took out a flask from a special hiding place under the seat. Georgie don't like me to have too much of this these days, but I save this for special occasions, and if you're about to get your ship back, I reckon that counts. He peered at the liquid. What is it? He said curiously. His translator had been adapting quickly, and was already much better with intonation. Genuine local brew Tennessee whiskey, required for toasting anything worth celebrating. He poured out a measure into the cap and handed it to Moonrunner. I'm trusting you to know whether this'll poison you or not. The alien took a sniff. It's certainly toxic, but my neural implant isn't flagging it as lethal. What are we toasting? Why, the one thing that's always worth toasting, to freedom. To freedom! JJ took a swig straight from the bottle, and Moonrunner downed his capful and immediately started coughing violently. After a few seconds, he settled down again, but he was so still that for a moment JJ thought he'd done him some harm. Then the alien looked up, and his big black eyes fixed on JJ. Then he grinned. I could sell this. And that was the start of not just a beautiful friendship, but a very lucrative business partnership.